So let's talk about the Africa Day 2022, which was marked by the African Union on Wednesday and centered around nutrition for the continent's estimated 1.2 billion population, majority of whom are women, children, and youths. Now, the managing director at Energy Capital and Power, Leila Bastati, believes that making a strong case for energy is a key driver of food resilience and climate change mitigation. Bastati joins me now for a chat to this on the show tonight. Good evening to you, madam, and great having you on the show here.
Good evening, Bosun. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much, Leila. Where do you think, at ECP, where do you think the nexus is between energy and food security, and how can energy enhance food resilience for us on the continent?
Well, for us, food security cannot be attained without energy security. The way we see it, energy is really the basis of economic development of any economy. And so inevitably, it is a fundamental tool if we want to tackle food poverty across the continent. We really must understand that the energy industry is much bigger than just keeping the lights on, because it has the ability to fuel development in every sector. And particularly when we talk about powering large-scale industrial food production and the distribution systems that will allow that food to reach those in need. The fact that Africa's population is set to grow at a much faster pace than any other region on the planet inevitably makes these systems more and more critical, and they will power a supply chain that will have to grow with a rise in population. It is fundamental, at ECP we believe that it is fundamental to point out that all energy sources, including fossil fuels and renewables, make a significant contribution to feeding the world. Just look at natural gas, which is the base of the production of so many of the fertilizers that allow us to increase the yield of our crops worldwide. And that is the real answer to your question. Energy will allow traditional farming to be made industrial.
Okay, so food and fuel challenges, you just saying, Leila, are mounting for sub-Saharan Africa. What do you think should be the roadmap or strategy at mitigating what lies ahead? The AFDB is just talking about 1.5 billion. The board just approved $1.5 billion. The World Bank and the IMF is also thinking of throwing additional billions of dollars into the mix because of the whole problem with food, fertilizer that we're seeing the crisis from Eastern Europe.
Thank you for the super interesting question. Both to me, this is truly one of the biggest challenges of the century. In my view, enabling access to all forms of energy is key for improving food and fuel security. If you think that today in Africa, 450 million people suffer with food insecurity and 600 million people do not have access to electricity. Without electricity, how can we expect to power industries, factories, large-scale agriculture? Again, if you think that today 65% of Africans still rely on traditional farming, you can start to understand the extent of this challenge. Not to mention that these farmers are the most exposed to the impact, obviously, of climate change. They need to be protected and given the opportunity to thrive. And energy access is the solution once again. So for us, the roadmap is clear. Access to energy means access to food on a large scale. We have to use energy to address the food crisis, and we have to do it now. Food aid has never worked as a long-term solution, and it is now the time for Africa to use its resources to power itself, and above all, to feed itself. Undoubtedly, the international community has an important role to play, but it needs to focus on enabling energy and industrial development so the communities can be self-sustaining.
Interesting what you mentioned, but do you think the African Union, the EFDB and other key agencies, do you think they're moving the needle in providing needed investment. Your organization is also about mobilizing investments for Africa. So in terms of food, fuel, and fertilizer and so on, do you think we're seeing enough movement, motions and movement that we can rely on? Do you think we need more interventions, we need more investments into all these key areas now on the continent?
Absolutely. These organizations and others like them are really important to address the investment gap that we see in these sectors. After all, financing the steps of progress will always be the biggest challenge. They are particularly important because they are African and they understand the problems of the continent, as well as the cultural specificities of the regions they operate in. In that sense, they really have contributed to address energy and food poverty in many regions of the continent, establishing partnership with international and local organizations, and addressing real issues on the ground. Energy Capital and Power, ECP, the company that I lead, has had the privilege to engage with some of these organizations in the promotion of investment into the African energy sector in a very fruitful manner.
Interesting, you've got a number of summits lined up for the rest of the year, later in the year. Tell me about these events. What should everyone expect across the various countries where some of these summits will take place? It looks like energy is one of the biggest conversation after food is fuel, which is energy, right now on the African continent. Nothing since the pandemic, 2020, 2021, this is the biggest story everyone is chewing all around. Tell me about your coming summits at ECP.
Thank you very much. Indeed, in the second half of the year, ECP is working on producing 3 large-scale events. The first one will be in early September, and we will host a large West African energy event in Senegal. It's the MSGBC Oil, Gas and Power. That will be followed in mid-September by the 5th edition of our East African Conference in South Sudan, which is South Sudan Oil and Power. And at the end of November, we will be producing one of Africa's largest energy events in Angola, which is Angola Oil and Gas. All 3 conferences have widespread government support, are sponsored by some of the world's leading energy and finance companies. And I think that the timing for these events is really critical. You have the political shifts in Europe, the fundamental developments in many corners of the continent that are putting Africa at the center of the dialogue and the global debate. And this is exactly what our events offer, a platform for that debate, while at the same time attracting billions of dollars in foreign investments to the continent.
Very interesting. I'm sure you picked those countries, Angola and South Sudan. Tell me a little bit why you think Angola should be a point of destination as well as South Sudan. Give me about a minute or so left on those 2 countries.
Well, I am actually currently in Angola. It's quite a critical time for Angola. They have elections coming up in the next couple of months. Italy has recently signed a deal with Angola and also Congo, the Republic of the Congo, for them to supply natural gas, which clearly now with what is happening with Russia and Ukraine is quite a fundamental point. We have been in the country for 4 years producing this large event. This year particularly, we're looking at energy transition and local content. And we are trying to include, speaking about investments, a lot of financing. This week alone, I've met with the top 5 banks in the country, because it is time for them to be part of the conversation.
We really appreciate speaking with you and sharing your insights on our Rice Exchange tonight. Thank you so much for your time, and see you next time. We wish you all the best.
Thank you so much. It was lovely.
Thank you so much, Lila Bastati, Managing Director at Energy Capital and Power. Have a great evening.